Thank you, colleagues. So, before I talk about what the objective is and the purpose is for this particular session, let me just say that you'll see on your programs that we are we're scheduled to finish here at 15:30, right? And that's the plan. But I don't want to put anybody here under any pressure, including our colleagues in the front here, to draw us out. To last the full 2 hours. If we don't make the full 2 hours, please, we will stop. Is that okay? On the other hand, if the temperature of stimulation is so intense here, we will go to 5:30. Right? So we will see how the thing unfolds. All right, so thanks for that. So just to tell you a little bit about the session. So the previous session was the fall session. This session is the rising section. It's the making section. So we're going to talk here in the session here about the making of Mr. Mandela. It's a deliberately set of chosen constructs to try and help us come to deal with a very particular part of what the politics of Mr. Mandela is all about. So what we're going to do here, and we're going to be led by Ciraj Rassool, about whom I'll say a bit in a minute. We're going to be led by Ciraj, who will do some recognizable things. So he's going to do what a good historian does, and he will give you a sense that, you know, there's a big debate in history about the great man, right? So those of you who've done History 1, how many of you have done History 1? Okay, so you would have had that moment in the syllabus when the great man in history as an approach to history is something that you'll have that fleetingly. It'll come and you'll recognize it in a minute and it'll be over. Then we're going to get to this really difficult stuff about history itself. And Ciraj is essentially, he's made his life that in the last 25 years. This thing about how do you do history? How do you write history? You know, how do you work with this challenge of how a history is constructed? And he's going to talk a little to that. And it's a really important question. It's a question which, of course, takes political form in this country, with many people talking about invisible histories, histories that have been erased. There's a lot of discussion about the dominance of a particular narrative and how that narrative comes to stand in for the whole story. You know, when the story is actually and always a great deal more complicated. So he's going to deal with that, but then he's going to also deal with, and I know this simply because I was able to read his thesis, he's going to deal with this really difficult question of how the story of Mr. Mandela itself is made. How Mandela is constructed, right? And there are many important things that he's going to be bringing to our attention. But what I'd like us just to keep in mind in all of that, and it bears a little, where's Petronella? Okay. It bears on her interest in leadership. And that big question is to ask this and I'd like us to deal with it, Ciraj, is Mr. Mandela's role himself in his own making, right? What role does he play in this process of how he is constituted, constructed as volunteer in chief? When it comes to the making of the Freedom Charter, there's a conscious decision to make Mr. Mandela the major figure in that particular process. Now, how that happens, and the politics of all of that is what we're needing to engage with, and then of course into these different roles and spaces into which he moves later on his life, and from my own, as I say, angle of interest is his own. And I'm not going to use the word complicity because it sounds too devious. He's not a devious person in that sense, but he plays a role in that. And how do we, come to understand that role in thinking about self-awareness, thinking about consciousness of leadership? So when Ciraj is done, would you like to go immediately after that? Or Lebo, or do you want to wait? Or should we go to the floor first and then have you come back towards the end? At what point would you be comfortable with
however the spirit moves it.
Okay, however the spirit moves. Okay. Okay. So we have two great colleagues here. Ciraj Rassool is an historian. He's doing right now this really difficult work of working with human remains which have been taken out of the country as part of this whole big anthropological project of trying to understand race and human beings and so on. So he spends a lot of time in Berlin at the moment, working with paleoscientists and politicians in terms of trying to work out the dynamics and the politics of this unaddressed colonial relationship that the Germans have with the South Africans. And it's, as he says, it's really hard work. Moletsane, whom many of you know, is going to do the sense making, the response for us here, and she comes to it with a long understanding of how education and the making of sense works in a classroom. And it's for that reason, Lebo, that you as a sociologist, as a feminist, as a pedagogy person, so you understand how the package kind of comes together. And you're going to be making sense of this package here for us here. So really look forward to that. So over to you, Ciraj. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Crain. That one does work. Crain and I have been comrades for many years, going back to the 1980s when we were in the Civic Association in Salt River Woodstock Warm Estate, so in the trenches, as it were. Crain also later went to teach at the high school that I went to, and later at the University of Cape Town. When I was at UWC, we did work together in the District 6 Museum, in conceptualizing the museum. So all my thinking about biography, about the production of history and the production of biography, the biography as production and contestation, were developed in conversation with many people, but also in conversation with Crain, as we learnt to as we try to find a path for what could be a kind of activist scholarship. And as Crain has told you, many years ago now, I spent some time writing a biography of Isaac Pangani Tabata, who was from the Eastern Cape, but did so at a time when South Africa, in the period of transition, became characterized by a biographic order in which biography was inscribed into the very sinews of being a new South African and into the matrix of the nation. And so, as I tried to grapple with a biographic project and to rethink the whole project of biography outside of the straitjacket of the choice between the great individual or the primacy of the collective, what I tried to do was to find a more serious place for biography, one that could be scholarly, justifiable, beyond any notions of greatness on the one hand, or somehow wanting to uncover some hidden flaw on the other hand. So I want to talk about these issues of production and contestation of Nelson Mandela's biography by going back to a series of important moments in Nelson Mandela's relationship with the people of South Africa and its history of exploitation and oppression that Mandela had to deal with and address after his release from prison. In doing this, I'm very aware, as we have heard this morning, that thinking about the meaning of Mandela and considering his biography is not merely about understanding the past. Instead, these inquiries about the life history, values, and meaning of Mandela are profoundly about the present, and indeed about constructing futures for South Africans and for the people of Africa more generally. Reappraising Mandela comes at this time of considerable political dispute and tremendous doubt. South African society has been through a significant period marked by rampant corruption and state capture that has troubled any sense of leadership continuity, certainly in the ruling party, that has even threatened to interfere with the understandings of Mandela. The recent political assertiveness on the part of South African youth and students, as you know, has also generated a critique of reconciliation politics that have been associated with Mandela. This critique was also voiced, as you will remember, in the wake of the death of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, with some asserting that they had supported the wrong Mandela. I want to discuss the case of the special red-colored Mercedes-Benz W126 S-Class 500 SE that was built in 1990 by workers at the Mercedes-Benz plant in East London, South Africa, and presented to Nelson Mandela as a gift shortly after his release from prison. With motor parts donated by the company, the car had been built by hand by workers outside of the normal working hours and completed in only 4 days. The vehicle was presented to Mandela on the 22nd of July 1990 in a special occasion held at Sisa Dukashe Stadium in Dansane before 30,000 people. Now, accounts of the 1990 Mandela Mercedes-Benz events and their meaning have differed. And these contests of history have been depicted in 2 films containing recollections by automotive worker union organizers, Mercedes-Benz management, and industrial conflict facilitators. One film called Labour of Love, produced in mid-2013 for Mercedes-Benz South Africa, as Mandela's health went into decline and his death was thought to be imminent. This film, 2013 film, was celebratory, emphasizing the car as a gift of the workers and presenting the company as a pioneer of reconciliation, the first to formally recognize a black labor organization. Circulated and promoted internationally within the automotive industry and the business press more generally after Mandela's death in December 2013. This short film was used to promote a 23-year association between Mercedes-Benz and Mandela, albeit through the labor of the community of factory workers. With the film, the company claimed its commitment to South Africa, its workers, and general reconciliation, symbolized as early as 1990 by the agreement between the workers and the company to produce the gift, and personified by Mandela. As the inscription at the end of the film declared, South Africa, together we are better. Simunye, I suppose. Now, for the workers and other members of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, the building of this special car was an opportunity and a method to embrace change and unity, and to provide unity within the workforce. This car was not only a gift from the NUMSA members, but in spirit from workers in general. For the workers, the car was made of many small parts. And it was like South Africa, that belonged to all who lived in it, black and white. South Africa for them was like the small parts of the unit that we built, that had been brought together by Madiba, and that were all moving forward today. Mandela's response, as reported in the film Labour of Love, was that the car and its color would remind him not only of NUMSA members, but of the blood that had been spilt by many South Africans. For this freedom in South Africa, this is what it would mean for Mandela. The workers' message to Mandela was that the car that had left the plant blemish-free as the best ever built in its class was a labor of love. Now, another film called Red was produced a year later by the artist Simon Gush, in collaboration with the actor and playwright James Cairns, and shown as part of Gush's installation art exhibition, also called Red, that opened in Johannesburg in 2014. and the following year in East London itself. Gush sought to understand the July 1990 events of producing and presenting the Mercedes-Benz in light of the 9-week illegal strike and the plant sleep-in that workers embarked upon only a few weeks later. Inspired by the commitment of the East London auto workers to produce the car for Mandela, as well as by their resilience during the 9-week strike and occupation of the plant afterwards, Gush was indeed intervening in how those events should be remembered. Gush's film revealed a more complex story than that of an enlightened Mercedes-Benz company and the claim of a mutually beneficial relationship between the company, the union, and the workers. It revealed a much more divided workforce, some of whom still suffered after being dismissed 23 years previously for their participation in the strike. Gush and Cairns showed that there was more to the story than the warm and fuzzy celebratory narrative of Mandela, Mercedes-Benz industrial stability. In the exhibition Red, the disassembled body panels of a replica car, each part in a different tone of red, were exhibited alongside reconstructed displays of sleep-in strike beds made of scaffolding, foam, upholstery, and car headrests, and imagined uniforms of striking workers. With the film, Gush has chosen to pose questions about the Mercedes-Benz gift and the world of automotive labor in East London in 1990, and the celebratory frames of the Nelson Mandela biographic order through which the corporate narrative has understood them. Here, the Mercedes-Benz replica, go back twice, stripped down to its parts, was turned into an inquiry, almost an autopsy. Let me repeat that. Almost an autopsy into the labor process and the events of the strike that questioned the reconciliatory and celebratory views of the gift as a product of a partnership between the workers and management. The installation Red was also an engagement with the cultural production of Nelson Mandela, of the meaning of the man and how he should be remembered. Now, during the 1990s, the biographical life of the leader took on a new centrality in the public domain in South Africa. Mandela's life history, narrated as the long walk to freedom, came to be inscribed into South Africa's process of nation-making as the seeming embodiment of its heritage and the immortal guarantor of its future. With modes of biographical narration and concepts of greatness and exemplary lives also incorporated into the rituals of governance, political transformation, economic relations, and public policy. Now, Nelson Mandela's auto/biography came to stand at the apex of a biographic order in South Africa. The processes of producing, deploying, contesting, and maintaining Mandela's life story. Yes, one of the things that I develop in my work is the idea of biographic maintenance. Right? And we need to think about the work of biographic maintenance that we do as we do the contestation as well. The processes of producing, deploying, contesting, and maintaining Mandela's life story have gone through several phases and purposes as evidence of epic and noble resistance in the face of apartheid's treason charges, as resource for consolidating the movement in exile, as source of unswerving strength and moral authority in the final push against apartheid, and as narrative of confrontation, wisdom, leadership, and reconciliation. Yet instead of trying to analyze such a cultural history of Mandela's biography, much more has been made of what his life as activist, prisoner, leader, president, and retired politician symbolized in relation to the narrative of the South African nation and the triumph of the human spirit. The cultural study of Mandela has tended to be limited to attempts to understand Mandela the symbol and how it is put to use as a brand of leadership and its associated significance, rather than a study of the cultural politics of Mandela's biography. This attention to leadership and style was amplified around the time of Mandela's death, with a range of academic and public projects that sought to appreciate his image, his meaning, and legacy from different disciplinary perspectives. And I'll just briefly go through some of them. I'd written this, much more of this. In fact, I slashed some of this morning, but I should have left them in. But take, for example, Zolani Ngwane, who has shown how, in his trial, Mandela's body became the dominant icon, decentering the conventions of South African courts of law with an affected ritual elaboration and providing a mnemonic device for oral reconstructions of that event for many years to come. In the process, Mandela became both the embodiment of the struggle and a vicarious sacrifice for it. By wearing his Tembu costume in court, Adam Seitz added, Mandela was treating his position as an outlaw, as a rogue whose exteriority from the law was demanded by the law itself, to position him precisely as the personification of the sovereign power of the excluded African majority. Now, in a thoughtful analysis of the contested meanings, legacies, and images of Mandela shortly after his death, my UWC colleague, Suren Pillay, noticed the presence of two soundtracks, sometimes in discordant cacophony, at Cape Town Stadium, where people went to mourn Mandela, with the official event governed by the restriction of protocol that sought to project a method of mourning devoid of politics. The music from the podium conflicted sharply with the constant singing and faint humming from the stands that expressed itself as sometimes rising and bursting through. At times, this crowd singing was uncontainable and irrepressible in the face of stern remonstrations from the podium. The comrades had splintered into scattered generations with diverse fates that now include both the beneficiaries and the losers, the unemployed and the new business elite, the party officials, the parliamentarians, the bureaucrats, and also the most vocal critical dissidents and leaders of new social movements. For Pillay, there was an unnamed sense of incompleteness and a ritual of mourning and celebration that many South Africans still needed to have for Nelson Mandela, and that was the ritual of burying a comrade. This occasion would be a place and time where the songs that were erupting from the crowd, he says, could be taken up and sung from the podium, and would also restore Mandela to his place within a political community. But aside from these representations of Mandela's leadership and legacy, image and myth, here I want to suggest that it is also necessary to appreciate the history of Mandela's biography. This requires an analysis from when the narrative began, how and through what relations it was crafted, when it was deployed and re-narrated, and even how it was contested. There is a longer line of biographical work to consider too, on how Mandela's narrated life came to be inscribed into South Africa's process of nation-making as embodying its heritage and ensuring its prospects. The cultural production of his life through the medium of biography is complex, involving the intervention of experts and assistants, promoters, publicists, and image makers over time and through several media. Some of these narratives were also simultaneously autobiographical, as Mandela tried to take part not only in managing his iconic image and shaping a mantle of godlike leadership, but also in producing and deploying the story. The prime example of this, of course, was Long Walk to Freedom, published under Mandela's name and in his own voice, but co-authored, as you will know, by the journalist Richard Stengel. After his 1962 last stand in court, Mandela's stirring Rivonia speech from the dock in 1964 had resonated throughout the world. The ANC realized that their cause would be best served by putting forward a charismatic leader, someone who would capture the imagination and symbolize in his own person the struggle against apartheid. And with Oliver Tambo, the ANC employed the tactic to build up Mandela internationally as the charismatic personification of the South African struggle. This work called for deliberate biographical acts, with Mandela's stories put to work to drum up support for a liberation movement in exile and frame the struggle against apartheid just as he disappeared from the public eye. This tactical decision also entailed building and projecting biographical material and images of the imprisoned Nelson Mandela, where he was constructed in heroic terms as the natural-born leader of the South African people, who sacrificed and toiled in the face of apartheid repression. From then on, according to Luli Kalinikos, the image of Mandela grew steadily in stature and was to become a successful weapon in globalizing the struggle against apartheid. The discursive construction of the biographical narrative of Mandela moved through several phases, from born leader to sacrificial hero to messiah, culminating in the South African biographic order with Mandela as symbolic father with paternal authority in the public sphere. These phases saw a variety of mediating agencies conduct the work of biographical production and maintenance, so that the narrative of Mandela's greatness and the triumph of reconciliation could be inscribed into the sinews of the new nation. This occurred through new national museums and systems of national heritage, and through the tourist gaze on the Rainbow Nation, which made South Africa knowable for international visitors as well as for South Africans. Mandela's long walk came to be installed at the apex of South Africa's heritage landscape through a phalanx of museums, heritage sites, exhibitions, and public art projects, with Robben Island set as the birthplace of the new nation and the site of its first national museum. After Mandela's retirement from formal politics and then from public life, the work of taking up the maintenance of Mandela's biography fell to the Nelson Mandela Foundation. This the foundation has done, I want to suggest, with quiet dignity in the face of its use in ancestral politics and its crass commercial appropriation by some members of the Mandela family, and of its deployment by the ruling party under Zuma to uphold an impression of ethical government. With the creation of a Nelson Mandela Center of Memory, curated as a digital accessible archive, the foundation has sought to turn Mandela's biography into a project of service, as a legacy and resource for human rights work, non-racialism, dialogue, and social advocacy, as we have heard. During the 1990s, as the biographic order took root, the Mandela auto/biography of suffering, resilience, overcoming, forgiveness, reconciliation, and magic was reworked and consolidated. As the internal and external contradictions of a settler post-colony were temporarily brought into a momentous but unsteady alliance with the new nation, varied national and international constituencies sought inclusion in the story of greatness, or even just an association with the narrative. The red Mercedes-Benz that was presented to Nelson Mandela in July 1990 was given to him, importantly, at a time of transition in the life of his auto/biography, in which the biography was changing alongside the shift in his life. This was a changeover from the biography of desire for the absent revolutionary leader to a biography of the statesman and the president. It is this turning point in the biography of the absent leader to the biography of the statesman and the president that partly explains the ambiguous history of the gift as labor of love on the part of the NUMSA workers and as donation by Mercedes-Benz South Africa. It is significant that Simon Gush chose to take issue with the warm and celebratory interpretations of the gift, inspired by the commitment of the East London auto workers to produce the car for Mandela, as well as by the resilience some of them showed during their 9-week strike and sleep-in. Gush has indeed intervened in how these events should be remembered. By exhibiting the disassembled body panels of the replica car alongside reconstructed displays of sleep-in strike beds, scaffolding foam, upholstery, car headrests, with imagined uniforms of striking workers, as I've said to you, Gush has chosen to disengage the events of 1990 from the celebratory frames of the Mandela biographic order, stripped down to its parts and exhibited almost forensically. The replica Mercedes-Benz was turned into an inquiry into the labor process and the strike that challenged the idea that the gift stemmed from a partnership between the workers and management. Gush focused instead on the affection and spirit of celebration that had marked every step of how the workers built the Mercedes-Benz for Mandela with their own hands and in their own time. Throughout the labor process, there had been an official handover from one station to the next, with the car gloriously placed upon a trolley, delivered by singing and toy-toying workers. And for one of the worker leaders, Philip Groom, this was a vehicle that the workers built with passion, each part, large and small, lovingly assembled. All workers wanted to be part of this and wanted to touch this vehicle. I'm interested in what Gush did with a replica, a Mercedes-Benz, when it was taken bit by bit and taken into the gallery. The doorless, bootless, bonnetless body of the car was placed on a stand and surrounded by mounted doors, boot and bonnet, replete with faux radiator and spring-loaded movable Mercedes-Benz star. Now it was an installation of each of its parts, each an element of the labor of love turned into an artwork of inquiry. This exhibition also enabled Gush to transform the body parts into an audio-visual post-mortem on the history of Mandela, the gift, and the strike. For Gush, these elements showed how the plant had been used in a different kind of way. The workers had repurposed the factory to produce something for themselves. Even the car itself was conceptually different to the others, also made in the plant. The repurposing of materials involved a creative act and was a means for workers of visualizing themselves. When the red Mercedes-Benz was made and handed over to Mandela, this vehicle had been freed from the corporate world and personalized through choice of color, cultural ceremony, and an outpouring of joy on the plant floor. It may have belonged to a particular series of S-Class Mercedes-Benzes, but it was by far the best one ever made. Assembled with love, it had been individualized in an intimately direct association with Mandela, albeit the absent leader and pater familias en route to being a statesman and a president. But as much as it represented love, for Gush, it also represented labor. Mandela's Mercedes-Benz had become an artifact of labor history. This line of inquiry into the history of labor was also a more appropriate way to understand the significance of Mandela. The installation, wherever it was displayed, was a vivid disassembly of the corporate narrative of reconciliation and an insistence that Mandela's life history is best understood as a resource for critical social inquiry. This was indeed the work of a revolution. Thank you.
Okay. That was quite something. I'm going to take a few minutes. So, Ciraj, a personal question. How do you personally come away from that? You know, from thinking about just the taking of this biography and disassembling it and reconstituting it in these really quite discordant parts. I mean, how do you just as a South African walk away from that?
I suppose what as a child of Mandela, who has been caught up inside of the familial associations of warmth and closeness, and in spite of the ways in which we understand these to be mythical creations of the warm, fuzzy, grandfatherly dancing, the political meaning of Mandela has also captivated us. But as one has understood the way biographies have been deployed, how they've been put to work, how they've been mobilized, I've been interested myself to want to disrupt the dominant meanings of Mandela. And I think, and to chart the ways in which the disruptions have happened. And what has been quite interesting, quite frankly, has been how, despite being the official institutional forum through which the values of Mandela are guarded, the foundation has also been one of the prime sites of disruption. Been one of the sites in which an argument has been made for what Mandela means and what Mandela's biography means. And to put that biography to work that the conventional narrative does not adhere to. Because the conventional narrative has been able to coexist with the crass commercialization that you see everywhere, with the heroic narrative, one that was incorporated into the party, but where, without saying these things, needing to operate in very humble ways, in principled ways, in ethical ways, the foundation was never needed to be seen intervening in public. In those times around Mandela's, at the time of Mandela's death and the funereal events, when all of the contestations were happening between the party and the family, it was very interesting to see the quiet dignity on the part of the foundation. So, for me, my task would be to enhance the contestation, to enhance the conflict over meanings, and to position Mandela's biography as resource for critical inquiry, rather than one in which South Africans have been asked to rote learn a certain kind of narrative and to understand themselves as almost captured within that narrative of the long walk to freedom, in which, as Carolyn Hamilton once put it, you have a convened concept of citizenship in which people are far more subjects than citizens. So Mandela's biography needs to become a means of social enablement rather than one of containment. And there are some basic elements that can be chosen. I mean, one of the key elements of Mandela's life history actually happens in Cape Town. But the conventional biographies don't narrate that, because that is a moment in which Mandela's making happens in a conversation with I.B. Tabata in Cape Town. It happens in an association with the Unity Movement and in the setting of where the New Era Fellowship used to gather. Mandela used to go and stay at the Stakesby Lewis Hostel in District 6. And so for the ruling party to admit that would not be to its advantage. You know, the self-made narrative of the triumph of the ANC. And so there are a number of examples of how narratologically one can work with the narrative and produce something quite different.
Great. Okay. Lebo, you want to pitch in, or do you want to wait?
Maybe I should put it. I don't know.
What does the mood say to you? Sorry, the spirit. The ghosts. So the VC is not here. Okay? No, she was recalling this ghost of Mr. Mandela last night. So,
Yeah.
So in that spirit, yes, please.
Okay, so you had the man. So I almost don't want to spoil it by editorializing about what he said. But I'll do a little bit of what Crain asked me to do, which is to say, what do we learn epistemologically and pedagogically from the biography of Mandela? I'll try my best. So let's go back to the Foley session before lunch, which reminded us very clearly that decolonization is not a metaphor, or should not be a metaphor for the many, often irrelevant things that institutions such as the university and the state do in the name of transformation. So decolonization is not a metaphor. And if you want to read more about that, it's from the work of Eve Tuck, who is an indigenous scholar based at the University of Toronto, I think, who says that decolonization is about the repatriation or the restoration of human dignity to those who have been dispossessed. So that is the principle from which the Foley session before lunch wants us to move from. The very excellent presentation of Mandela's biography now tells us several things, one of which is Mandela's complexity, Mandela's multiplicity is after lunch, and Kimusoto, and Mandela's contradictions. And for me, as an educationist, this calls for what we've been talking about since yesterday, the need for us to move away from this discipline-based exploration of issues in our country. So Mahmoud Mamdani, in an article, I think it was in 2018, makes a very profound statement, I think, that it is striking in the post-colonial and I think in the post-apartheid era that the modern university does not resemble or resembles the colonial, the original colonial university, even though it is based in Africa. So the modern university is still organized around disciplines. It is still organized around hierarchies. It is still organized around different categories of people. So we have the managers, we have the academics, we have the students, and we have the administrators. So for Mamdani, that doesn't help us to address, to understand, and to address the very complex and intertwined issues that our society presents us with. Mandela's biography, and indeed any biographical research, reminds us of an old feminist saying, which is that the personal is political. So we look to Mandela's biography then in terms of, I think, three ways. The textuality of Mandela. So we look at these different texts that have been presented to us, various biographies, and indeed we look at the Mercedes-Benz, the biography of the red Mercedes-Benz, in terms of what it tells us about Mandela the phenomenon, about Mandela the man, about Mandela the symbol, etc., etc. We also look at the materiality of Mandela. And in the earlier session, we talked about the commodification of Mandela. And linked to that, the commodification of knowledge and knowledge production in the academy. It strikes me as an old academic that us old academics are not doing our job if we are not challenging the performative expectations that our neoliberal universities are putting on academics. So on one side of the fence are the students who are demanding for academics to decolonize the curriculum. On this side of the fence is the institution who are demanding, who have performative expectations on academics. So on the first day after which you are employed, you are asked, where are the publications, right? It is not where is the scholarship that seeks to understand the issues in our society. It is where are the publications. And in the middle is the poor academic who is trying to respond to both sides of the fence. And so I think, because what is UKZN going to do, fire me? People like me who are older and cannot be fired anymore, I think, should be challenging these performative expectations from the university, the neoliberalization of universities and the commodification of knowledge and knowledge production. But I think also Mandela's biography shows us the possibilities of moving away from the common damage-centered research and teaching that we often do when we are attempting to address social issues in the country, and to move towards what feminists are beginning to call a pedagogy of desire. So from this perspective, if you're constantly telling women or black students how disadvantaged they are, guess what? They are going to act disadvantaged. But if you show them the possibilities of harnessing the knowledges, the many knowledges and skills that they bring into the university for better learning within the university, then we stand a better chance of turning the tide around. Second to last of my point is, and if there's anybody who knows the translation of this Sesotho proverb, which is "Bohloko ba seeta bo bua ke mongaso," any Sesotho translators, loosely translated, and my grammar is becoming worse with the afternoon. It means that when the shoe is, the person who feels the pain of the shoe pinching them is the person wearing the shoe. I don't know how much that shoe is pinching her because I'm not wearing the shoe. Is that an English translation of that? Yes, you know it. So from that perspective then, biographical research suggests that if we take seriously the voices and the perspectives of the people who are experiencing the issues that we research with, we stand a better chance of understanding them through our transdisciplinary research, but also identifying and developing workable and effective problem-solving solutions. The last point I wanted to make, and it was almost an afterthought, but it was from the last statement you made about how the Mercedes-Benz was sort of taken apart, both literally but also symbolically. And it reminds me of the possibilities for transdisciplinary research, for example, using objects such as the Mercedes-Benz, but objects also such as the many textual representations of Mandela, to understand not only Mandela the person, Mandela the politician, Mandela the now late ancestor, but also the idea of the Mandelas with among us, if you know what I mean. So another methodology with which we can do this transdisciplinary research that is informed by biography, but also informed by a pedagogy of desire, but that would also use the objects the many objects that represent Mandela. Yes, that.
Okay, thanks very much, Lebo. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, let's take your responses. So lots of hands going up. Okay, so Kalela at the back there, Alan in the middle, and Shivani in the front here. Sorry, I don't know everybody's names. It might sound like it. It just happens that these are the folks whom I know.
Ciraj, I want to put So colleagues, I'm sitting here with quite a bit of unease as when Crain opened up, he spoke about the big man in history side versus almost the collective. And I grew up politically in the 70s with the Heinemann, African writer series, and so we used to read Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, etc. And we saw easily what was happening on the continent with the great man in history, being fated. You spoke earlier about, you mentioned people like Tabata, Mafeje, etc., and the kind of tradition that they came from. And it almost seems that in this country you have to err on this one side to be noticed and for your work to be read. It's interesting in only now because of the strong kind of gendered movement that we have in the country that a person like Ntantala is being resurrected and not necessarily just as the wife of AC Jordan. But what worries me politically, I'm just, because I think that as a university, I'm quite aware that there's going to be a complex deconstruction of Mandela in the inverted commas, as the VC said, last night. But I'm trying to think about our role, not only in South Africa, but on the continent, where people, of course, look towards this kind of myth of the great leader, where even people in this country start saying we're waiting for the next, Mandela to come. It's going to solve our problems. And how do we, as students of history and politics and economics, how do we try to let the populace understand more and more that they themselves are the motive force in history? How do we actually do that? Because there seemed to have been a movement where from when we, in the 1980s and 90s, there was a radical civil sort of society movement, and then we went, and now suddenly it's re-emerging. But so what is the place of what we are doing here with that?
I would just like to say thank you for a really excellent presentation and a lovely response as well. I thought it was very thought-provoking and the kind of conversations we need to have around Nelson Mandela. I'm particularly interested in your understandings of how biographies are mobilized to work. And I thought, when I was looking at our picture in front of us and the new Nelson Mandela icon, one wonders, why did we choose that particular biography to represent Nelson Mandela? And Lebo talks about the epistemological and ontological implications. And of course, I'm wondering, how does this particular biography that we have chosen, what are the implications for the epistemological and ontological journey that we now have as a university? In South Africa today, in an era of decolonization, because there's a sense in which this biographic image that we have in front of us is sort of the part of Mandela where he's very tolerant and he's saying, let's not disturb the status quo for the time being and that kind of thing. And I wondered, why did we not have a picture of Mandela in his youth, for example, as the activist? And because that kind of activist would, by nature, imply a disruption of the epistemological and the ontological. So thank you very much, both of you. I thought it was very enlightening.
Got a secret mic here. So many things on the table. I myself was interested in the design you know, what the work of a corporate department does when it gets given a brief to do the branding of a university. I mean, it's very beautiful, the yellow color and all of that. And that image, as I remember it, I mean, you see, the problem is you can't use any Mandela image because the Mandela photographs are a matter of commercial rights. I remember, and there are a few iconic photographs of Mandela, which one can see as kind of, these are kind of visual biographies. Portraits can be understood as that. There's the famous one taken by Jürgen Schaderberg of Mandela outside the window of his Robben Island cell. I remember, you know, he sold that image to Robben Island Museum to be used for 5 years in its work. Only 5 years? It was like very limited, but it cost a huge amount of money to use it for a limited period of time. I think that image is probably made by the government department, and it's a presidential image. That was like, that's what I seem to remember it on. It's an image from political posters. So that is transferred from the poster to the university branding thing and changed through these circles and triangles, through these Greek objects, and that are meant to signify a university. So, you know, there's clearly a lot going on in that. But what you're pointing to, and I mean, the thing that is we have to acknowledge of why we are here, because this is a major thing of the transfer of a metropolitan university in the Nelson Mandela Metro that has its origins in a Broederbond-created University of Port Elizabeth. Not just a white university, but a Broederbond-created university. The transfer to something that calls itself Nelson Mandela University means that they take upon to themselves tremendous responsibilities. Otherwise, this is a crass opportunistic association that is desired to make themselves suddenly look different, to be able to attract students from wherever. This is work that has to be done, of making the meaning of a Nelson Mandela University. And the choices are there. The choices are there. You know, and what we have done is put some ideas on the table for what those possibilities are. You know, there's the possibility of the Mercedes-Benz a company that was incidentally made by an advertising agency called Ginkgo, which was also the agency whose photographer did those Sunday Times photographic portraits of great South Africans. You remember that project? That was also involved with Mandela. I mean, there's a long history to that. In other words, the commercial stuff and the desire to be alongside Mandela is more ingewikkeld. It's more, you know, it's a more difficult history. And this can be that. And there's certainly going to be accusations, but the work has to be done to make sure that it is not that. That it is precisely a desire for a university as a critical space, right? To turn this and quite frankly, this is the work of the humanities. This is the work of developing the humanities in Port Elizabeth. In other words, this university says that this is going to be a home of the critical humanities. I understand this. And so, another very interesting thing for me today, seeing that we're talking about pedagogy and what is possible within a university. Of course, universities are spaces of privilege, as Crain says. They are spaces in which students are being turned into holders of privilege, in which students have to face the terrible reality that they are being asked to take power over the people, to take power over the communities they come from, but to turn themselves into humane power holders, and to maybe even go further than that, to reject the paradigms of trusteeship that they are meant to take onto themselves. But the presumption that we have here, it's been a very interesting, even on the part of the contributions from students, from people who are closer to their student lives than some of us are. Yes, universities are institutions of privilege, but you get privilege and you get privilege. That is the point that I want to make. And not a single presentation has imagined what it is like to inhabit the historically black university in South Africa, and what it means for the historically black university to become excellent. In other words, the university created to fail. The university created to be inferior, that then becomes excellent. And for a student to go through the process of learning at such a university where, yes, that student is required to take power, but it is a very different kind of taking of power. Now, to a large extent, I think Fees Must Fall has been about the terrible realization by black students of what happens to them in a white university. That has been, and it's been a very particular experience in universities in South Africa, because quite frankly, universities are some of the most untransformed institutions in our country. We have held onto a university apartheid that is so pernicious that it's almost going to kill all the work that we want to do, unless we start unmaking those cleavages that for the students seem naturalized and almost frozen in. And, you know, when you become a new nation, you become a new nation through history. You become a new nation through proclaiming yourself to be historical. And one of those modes of narration is through making the great leader. And it is part of the project of South Africa's modernity, has been the narrative of the leader, and it's the outcome of a nationalist movement, of the movement itself being a knowledge project, being a project that historicizes itself. And if we think about the problem that Xolela has raised for us, and I think he's right, about a racialized biographic order, of how that has been installed, how that was installed, how it was installed through the movement. If one takes, for example, the work of the earliest Mandela biographers, of who are essentially Mary Benson and Ruth First, right? I mean, there's this amazing moment when the decision is made and Mandela is in prison and Mandela becomes the chosen leader to be built up. When suddenly she is required, she is required to produce the biography. Sorry, who am I talking about? Mary Benson. Mary Benson is required to produce the biography. She reflects on herself and she says, why didn't I know this at the time that I did the treason trial book, that Mandela was going to become important? Because I didn't interview him for long enough. I don't have enough information, right? So there's this, so in the mid-1950s, Mandela was not in that position. And so, but this was work that was done by a layer of support givers who started off their work in the Treason Trial Defense Fund, which then morphed later into the International Defense and Aid Fund, which was the location of generating ideas in the service of the liberation struggle, one element of which was the biography. And this was the work done by Mary Benson and by Ruth First. And, you know, of course, we inhabit these institutions of racialized power. We inhabit them, we study at them, we work inside of them, we work in them in South Africa, we work inside of them overseas. We are involved in South African studies as an international field, and African studies as an international field marked by disciplines, which is essentially a racialized knowledge domain of who has access to universities, who has access to publishing. And so, yes, it is the case. But I take your provocation to be a very important challenge of work that has to be done in this country, inside the university and outside the university, because universities are not the only spaces of knowledge. And this is something that I think Nelson Mandela University also has to consider, is what is its relationships with these other knowledge-producing agencies, one of which we are going to be inside tonight. And what is our responsibilities towards them as independent spaces? Because the test of that critical culture, that critical spaces of a critical citizenship that Vern is talking about and that Crain is talking about, are primarily outside the university. And those are the spaces that we have to think about providing resources for and working in partnership with, and ensuring that those are vibrant spaces, because that is where democracy is going to stand and fall.
You've also implicitly spoken to Alan's question.
I hope so.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything? Okay, colleagues, a little more. Or is this now it's winding down the time? Okay, so okay.
Mine is a very brief one, and it's directed to Lebu. When you made your comments, you urged us to move away from the discipline-based approach in exploring issues. And you spoke about the tendencies of universities to glorify publication. So I'm moving into scholarship. And scholarship, as we all know, is broad. Scholarship is not only limited to the tangible outputs. Can you assist us in exploring other forms of scholarship, going the full cycle of scholarship? Scholarship in being, scholarship in doing, and infusing scholarship in our approach, or infusing scholarship in our practice, and what elements of Nelson Mandela, the complex being, can we choose that will advance the agenda of scholarship?
So it seems to me that that we are doing an extraordinary disservice to the young activists. There's another provocation. To the young activists who, in the period 2015 to 2017 going forwards, have challenged us to deconstruct the post-apartheid university project. I say this because I think it is such a dense and difficult project. I think certainly if I reflect on Gramsci's writings in prison speaking about this project, it's a deeply ideological project. It's not only deeply ideological, it's a cultural project. And for us many of us simply to observe and to absorb this challenge, this storming of the Bastille, I think is problematic. I give the example of a project 1985 to 2005. Spectacular failure in the end. Significant project to deconstruct the post-apartheid school curriculum. Project called People's Education for People's Power. Great intentions. Good intentions. We set up our trade union, SATU, as the forefront of that project to deconstruct that curriculum and to put together for us this new curriculum, because we are aware, in the absence of us engaging with and contesting 360,000 teachers and getting them engaged in this project of becoming again intellectuals, of again beginning to rethink curriculum, that we would simply fail. Of course, we didn't take account entirely of the liberal post-apartheid project. I simply couldn't countenance the idea of a deep contestation of the curriculum, school curriculum I'm speaking about. And so without, let me put it differently, be more generous, with limited contestation, the administrators, including myself, in the State Department, National Department, were left without clothes. Because the ruling party the governing party simply packed up and said, this is a battle we're not going to fight. So I just use this, and we don't have time to go into the detail of this, just to give some kind of insight into a major decolonization, curriculum decolonization project, spectacular failure. And so what does that mean? It is clear, black and white academics, we carry baggage. To assume that because I'm black, I don't carry baggage is problematic. I think implicitly we are saying that we carry baggage, but we don't make it explicit. We've been trained in these institutions here in South Africa, colonial institutions and beyond. And so, going back to Tembeka's very insightful observations this morning, we have to go back to the archives. And I make this final point, again to illustrate simply. It's unrealistic to expect that there would be a biblical Damascus moment when I wake up one morning and I'm decolonized. I've made this point probably 100 times in the last 3 or 4 years. I make it again. It is totally unrealistic. And so there's a project there for us. In as much as we, in this instance, are reflecting on Madiba, in as much as we are seeking to excavate new insights and perspectives, in as much as we are seeking to retrieve him from the commercial, from interpretations that are problematic. I think we should challenge ourselves in this work, similarly, to ask questions and to engage ourselves. How do we begin to nurture wider groups? of masters and doctoral students and ourselves as young academics, as established academics, how do we begin to form, our student leader earlier spoke of book clubs. When do we form our own clubs as academics to begin this project? And so that's the challenge that I leave for us, Chair, that I think it is wrong for us. Those of us who have been there in the trenches, it is wrong for us simply to look the other way instead of playing a role of offering in humility, insights, perspectives, and to help secure this project so that it doesn't become a people's education for people's power, spectacular failure, because there's a risk that this will indeed become another spectacular failure. Thank you.
Okay, that's a hell of a complication. No, please, this Andre. But before panelists speak, so what you juxtapose there, Iron, is a moment in which we attempted to think about how we're going to be rewriting history. And a whole lot of us were involved in that. And some of us remember writing those manuals talking about how you write history. And it was an incredible mass campaign which went into schools in ways which we, to this day, have never been able to equal. To this day. I mean, that was, the story behind that we have not yet fully told. And the scale of that particular moment as a country, in terms of our mobilization, was incredible. And we don't have that here now. We absolutely, to say to Andre, we don't have that legitimacy, if you like, of that particular moment. Argue as we did, so it's more than a provocation, Iron. It's a real issue which I think, we're having to think about really. But how are we going to do this? How are we going to carry this moment into a step which is not more than simply symbolic?
I'm sort of tempted to carry on that
No, keep
discussion.
going. No, keep going.
All right, I'll make another.
Sorry, let me just say that. Sorry, just to say to all of you that we didn't mean this to be a forum in which some of us only would speak. We wanted all of you to feel a sense of not just being welcome here, but to have rights to engage with what these issues are all about. So please, however your stream of consciousness wants to take you, is how the spirit might move you.
Okay, well, my spirit is moved in the direction of this line of conversation, but I was going to make another point, but I'll try and introduce it anyway. And that is about the question of biography, because of course, on the one hand, I think I know what a biography is. And then I stop and think, and then I think, no, I don't know what a biography is, because it's really not at all clear. Is a biography a history of a life, or is it something different? And yes, Colella, it's true that we don't have many biographies of recent figures written by Black South Africans, but we have a really increasing number of biographies being written about people who lived at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm thinking here of the biography of Seme, or of the work that's being done on Charlotte Maxeke. So there's a lot of work coming up. Why is that work happening? And what are those authors doing by wanting to engage the biographical? And so when I think about that, I think one of the things we're interested in is this business of being able vicariously to watch another person act, which makes you think about yourself acting in history and in time. And I wonder if that isn't a way of confronting an ethical frontier. So you read someone else's life, either to see how they've failed, when you read the biography of a villain or a hero, but how difficult when when there's ethical compromise or ambiguity and so on. So I think that's one of the things. But another component that's incredibly hard to imagine is, how does the writer of the biography presume to sit in judgment of another life in quite that way? Because that seems an extraordinary thing to represent another life. And since there are biographers amongst us, I wonder how you pick up that responsibility. I wouldn't have the courage to do that.
I just want to dispel a myth that was Madiba's car, the Merc. My son, who's a student, when I told him I was coming to a Mandela Colloqium, he said, "Oh, do you know the song by AKA?" Now, do you know who AKA is? Some of you who are younger may know. Anyway, AKA is a rapper who grew up on the Cape Flats and then moved to Johannesburg and went to St. John's College. That's all important for this little story. And he wrote a song called Fela in Versace. I don't know if you know the song. It's Fela Kuti, the Nigerian singer, who's also a or was, because he's died, a human rights activist. So the song is about Fela in Versace, and when you see the video, you see this character, the writer of the song, the performer, walking up and down the road with a fancy car, sort of dripping gold jewelry. So, very sort of ostentatious display of wealth. And so one of the lines in the song, he says, what do they call me? They call me Fela in Versace, Mandela in a Rari. Now, it's not Mandela in Harare, it's Mandela in apostrophe R-A-R-I, in other words, in a Ferrari. So I just wanted to correct that misconception. And also, but more seriously, I'd like to know whether that is the view of young people, if that's their interpretation of Mandela. I mean, we've spoken about the commodification, the commercialization of Mandela, the brand. Is that all Mandela is to most young people in this country?
Okay, I'm going to throw it open to the floor. I'm not going to ask you folks to respond yet. Okay, who wants to go? Okay.
I was just saying to Selo, and I really need to make the point. The one is that it is an absolute treat to listen to real historians, It doesn't matter from what kind of frame these kinds of things come. So, Ciraj, thank you very much for this, and of course, Lebo for those thoughtful responses. And at that same very moment, connected to it is, of course, the revisitations of the archive, which is the provocation that Iron put on the table. And, of course, then the renewal of the humanities around that particular question itself. So I'm interested in this, in the shift away from the archival space as an excavation of the person and the archival space as an excavation of the figure, because that broadens the entire project in different kinds of directions as well. Remember that key to this is that people are in any case connected in different kinds of ways. And of course the social figure make precisely those connections possible if one approach it from that particular kind of angle. So yeah, I am, from our side, I am the morning session and now this one as well, very excited about the depth of the scholarly thinking and the pragmatic ideas and possibilities that are emerging in this space. And I just wanted to say thanks for that. It really stimulates the mind in ways that are new.
Mike's available. Open mic.
Good afternoon. Mine is a simple one, and it's linked to the question about writing biographies by blacks. And I'm sitting here wondering, why did Mandela himself choose to co-author with a non-African person? And I'm newly in psychology, and I'm sitting here and wondering, what is his psychological makeup? And who can then be the person to do the psychobiography of the man? And it won't be me.
I think I wanted to make this comment earlier on when the students spoke. Tembeka spoke about Mandela when he said, I'm a black man in a white man's court. And I'm thinking that within the university context, what does it mean to be a black child or a black person in a colonial university and sort of in a white man's land? And that experience, I think, should motivate us to working harder towards decolonization. And I know sometimes there was a bit of pessimism with regard to the way forward, and students were saying, we need to be taught, not taught, we need to be developed. But I was involved, in my faculty at the time of The Fees Must Fall, and I must say that students knew what they were talking about. And we mustn't underestimate what students can contribute. And if we I totally agree with you, Prof, that we need to go to the archives. We really do. But we also need to listen to the future, to the people of today, because they know what they are talking about. They're experiencing, and they know what it's like to be completely alienated. They spoke about being culturally alienated. There's also an epistemological and ontological alienation. And I think all these things should really motivate us to thinking a bit more about how do we take this process forward.
Let me just say to you, that alienation you talk about is multiple, right? White working class students come into the place and they go through the same kind of difficulties. Women come into those spaces and they feel these incredible difficulties. Pardon? So the university is a complicated space. And what I think we're needing to confront is how much that space is constructed around white middle class privilege and to reproduce white middle class privilege. So the university becomes a space in which that kind of experience is the primary thing for coming to university.
I suppose I'm taking it into myself. We've been in the space for more than, I've been in the space since '97. What have we done to change the space? We haven't done a thing. We talk, what are we doing to change the spaces to allow for that student who cannot make it in this world? Psychology is closed to black students. We've been talking about that since the 80s, 70s. It's not changing. And so are other disciplines. And what are we doing to change it as the collective in the room so that our students are not raped every day by other students who then say GBV as if it's a thing on the shelf and not an act that is perpetuated by us?
No, it was just when Michael was speaking, I was reminded of a documentary I saw quite a number of years ago and used quite a lot in my classes. I'm a political scientist by training. And it's about reconciling in difficult spaces. And I used Sierra Leone. And of course, the RUF, as you know, would chop off limbs, hands and limbs of people. And the one thing that's always stood out for me in that documentary is in an interview with Sanko, the RUF leader, he is asked what the people want, and he said the people want blood. And then he is asked, who does he admire most? Who does he think he is most like a leader? And he answered Nelson Mandela. So I think, if we look at representations of Mandela, it's not just within these university spaces, it actually goes broader into society, into other states, internationally, and I think that is something that we do need to consider as well in future.
My question is directed to Umamulebu. If it's more just clarity, balance almost. When we're talking about then using the biography as a resource for critical inquiry, as Dr. Rahul has said, when the making of Mandela is happening and the idea of him is being almost lifted from the man and creating then the social figure, does that become, or does he become, or does it become a colorblind, asexual, whatever that we must then mobilize to lean on, almost as an entire, as democracy itself, as justice itself, and we lean on it then almost to mobilize our own aspirations of equality and so on. And in thinking around that, how do women lean on that, and how is there space for Mandela to almost assist with ideas around equity for women? And even when we think about rape and gender-based violence, is it possible to draw something from the biography of Mandela to lean on, to assist with that kind of transformation?
Okay, that's a great closing question to leave with us. So I'm going to ask Lebo to close however she likes. However that spirit comes to you, Lebo. And then to ask Ciraj to make some closing comments, please.
So two sort of pedagogical questions have been asked. So how do we do research that rejects the performative expectations of universities on academics and still produce, I guess, quality scholarship? And I think that that question has been answered in various forms. But I would also like to say that if we believe seriously that the project of decolonization is a humanities project, and I'm translating humanities as meaning that we want to reclaim humanity in our communities. And that's secondly, the project must, I think it was the Vice Chancellor yesterday who said it must be a transdisciplinary project. And indeed, in the various presentations, we've heard about the complexity, about the interconnectedness and integratedness of Mandela, the phenomenon. So if we believe in transdisciplinarity, and we believe that therefore our project involves creating or developing new conceptual frames for meaning making and problem solving, then I think our research necessarily takes a different form. So my starting point is not what paper am I going to publish. My starting point is what is the social issue I'm trying to understand and help identify workable solutions for. If I publish a paper out of that, then well and good. If I don't, but I've helped or I've worked with communities to identify solutions to the problems that they identify for themselves. Then I would say that is, somebody referred to it, it was Crain, engaged scholarship. The second one is a bit more difficult. I struggle with the biography of Mandela as a tool for feminist scholarship, for example, because, well, for obvious reasons. But I think the silences and the blind spots in Mandela's biography offer opportunities for feminists to sort of ask the old question, the biography of the autobiography of the question. Why am I interested in Mandela's biography as a black South African woman? Yeah. So I think it offers opportunities to look back, look now, and look forward in terms of feminist scholarship. I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but we can talk later.
No, that's good. Yeah. No, it's good.
It's quite interesting to realize how much hope and desire people put in biography, in what biography can potentially do, right? And it's quite interesting to think about the kind of biography of biography, to think about the career of biography through different disciplines of life history, methods of research, of life narratives, of how biography is deployed in sociology, in anthropology, in literary studies. I mean, the one thing is that is certain, biography does not have a secure footing in the academy in the discipline of history. In fact, biography is seen as history light. It's like, in fact, you know, very much like if you go to exclusive books and you go to the shelf called history, you don't see academic books, but you see lots of big biographies of American political leaders and of celebrities, and it's something that grips the imagination. It's either about extolling greatness or it's about stripping bare the individual to expose a lie, right? So that's basically what you get. And it's quite interesting when the biography enters the discipline of history in a society at certain moments, as it did in South Africa. But it entered through critical projects. Now, biography, a notion of biography has always been there, but almost not as biography, but as kind of cultural studies. You know, there's Carolyn's study of the making of Shaga, for example. And you can think of, biography has been in South African historical scholarship as social biography, where the individual life was aggregated and taken to as part of an understanding of collectivities, or the biography has been studied as a means of understanding social questions, where the biography is a prism. Right, so this is like the history workshops research, mainly Johannesburg, of, you know, but it's biographical. But it's biographical that is also skeptical of biography and the concentration on the individual as a unit of analysis, right? On this methodological individualism. So generally the discipline of history has been very uncomfortable about this. So the question is to take this, and the other characteristic of it is that it's straight down the line, empiricist, chronological narrative. That's what biography is deemed to be. So there are a number of things to understand. Biography is not a book. Some people think of biography as a big book. I have 10 biographies on my desk. That is what, it's not a book, but the biography is a narrative of life. And it takes different mediums. It's expressed in different mediums. And the other thing is the biographical project is not one that starts ab initio with nothing there, as if the starting point is to gather the facts and to find the narrative, as if the narrative lies in the facts. So it's not just an archival, excavatory project. It's not excavation. It's much more complex than that. And the biographical work needs to think about genealogy. Because the thing about biography is that it is never without autobiography. The two always occur together. And one of the characteristics of my work, and it's a truism nowadays, is that to separate autobiography from biography is unhelpful. That you always have the one with the other. So that when someone does, when Colin Bundy was doing work on the Eastern Cape, on the rise and fall of the peasantry, he was doing an autobiography of his family's history in the Eastern Cape. So so writing the life of another is always also writing the self. The two always happen together. And my encounters, say, my project on the life history of Tabata was an encounter with prior narrations and a genealogy of narrations and deployments, and how a biography came to be deployed inside the movement at a certain time, and where, in fact, you had a shift from an earlier history in the movement of biographic denial to a later process of the embrace of biography as part of the movement, in fact, that culminated in a sense of presidentialism. Right? When you see this, like, you can never find photographs of Tabata in the 1940s, the high point of the unity movement, because they did not like biography. They didn't go into the studio. But later on, by the 1960s in exile, when you needed to make a case for yourself with the Liberation Committee of the OAU, you had to show yourself to be a liberation movement. And you did that through biography and portraiture. So you have the embrace of biography. And you can look at all of these projects in that way. Biography can be an extremely fertile, productive field for understanding the production of culture. One has to think about this through the lens of what a number of scholars call the production of history, where the work of scholarship is not just empirical, but it involves encounters with multiple forms of knowledge in different mediums. And I think in the case of Nelson Mandela University, the time has come for it to embrace, I suppose, the domain of public scholarship. And this is exactly the distinction that was made between scholarship and publications, right? Then what we are talking about is the cultivation of a sense of critical scholarship in the academy, but also outside.
Can I make one little point?
The spirit moved you.
Yeah. Yes, it did. Or he did. So I have this wild imagination. There's a seminar on the other side of the Crain, and it involves Mandela. It involves Masisulu. It involves John Langalibalele Dube. It involves, and I'm having a senior moment, John Dube's first wife. Yes, her. Sorry? Yes, Nokutela Dube. And they're having a discussion about, so what contributions did we make to the liberation of South Africa, and what contributions did we make to the post-liberation state of things? And lurking in the shadows, watching them, is a very less-known Xhosa poet that I only got to know only a few years ago, Nontsizi Mqwetho. And I'm mentioning that because I imagine her writing a very melodic Xhosa poem out of the discussions of these four struggling heroes. And I mentioned that because I'm wondering, we were talking about going back to the archives, but which archives? I haven't seen many books or any mention of Nontsizi Mqwetho as a huge Xhosa poet in South Africa. And why is that? Because she was a woman. And if we are to address those gaps, then I would like to just offer a resource that is easily available. And it's a project that is being run by Ndongela Masilela, who is a South African who taught at Hillside University and is retired and writing books out of Thailand. But he has a website where he collected or he developed archives for 10 years of 18th and 19th century Black intellectuals. And when you click on that website, it's a wonderful resource for students. So in this developing humanities project, I thought I should mention the work of Ndongela Masilela.
Okay, so I have been treated, and I hope that you feel likewise, colleagues. We've come to an occasion here which has treated all of us and provided us all with a respectful engagement with the project of the mind, but in a way which is not abstract and removed, but which has posed questions and challenges of us in a way which I really would like to say thank you very much to our panelists here this afternoon. I'd like to thank you all also and say that we've ended on exactly the right note, Lebo. Not the right time, the right note. We're going to move on to talking about the archives next. It's not an accident that the discussion has unfolded like that. The spirit has moved us correctly. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, colleagues and comrades and friends. Just a reminder, we will be at the South End Museum. All the other arrangements remain as is, okay? Just the venue is shifting. So see you later this evening. Okay, thank you so much for the day.